year was 1945. It was the final days of the war in Europe and the Battle of Berlin was raging. Soviet troops were advancing on three fronts, and the already weakened German military knew they were on the verge of defeat. As the artillery pounded the city to rubble, Hitler in his bunker in the heart of Berlin committed suicide. The war in Europe was over. It was time to rebuild. The Allied nations involved in those final battles had to find a way to put the country back together, so they came up with a plan. They would divide the nation in four. Each quadrant would be controlled by one of the four Allied nations: the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. So that no single nation would occupy the capital, Berlin was also divided in four parts, each controlled by one of the Allies, and Berlin is right about here. Right in the middle of the Soviet quadrant. You can see that this isn't going to end well. So how exactly did this lead to the wall? Well, in a way, it already existed. From those very early days, there was already an ideological wall between the Soviets and the rest of the occupying nations. Remember, between the end of World War I and the beginning of World War II, Germany and the USSR were allies and trading partners. It wasn't until Germany had invaded Soviet territory in 1941 that Stalin allegiances shifted. And by the end of World War II, the Soviet Union had accumulated more losses than any other nation, a death toll of 17 million people, 65% of all Allied fatalities. The other three occupying nations were prepared to help Germany to its feet. France, Britain, and the U.S. were working toward a goal of a functioning German government, a healthy economy, and a future of self-determination for its people. Success to them would mean they had another trading partner and ally in Europe. The Soviets, still stinging from betrayal and loss, harbored a plan to make Germany a part of the Soviet Union. For the first couple of years, things seemed to go pretty smoothly as the capital's infrastructure was rebuilt. Roads, schools, and hospitals were repaired and reopened, with the occupying soldiers working side by side with locals. But gradually, Stalin's true motives were revealed. The Cold War was beginning. Basically, his plan was to undermine the British-controlled region of Germany and wait for France and the US to withdraw, then absorb all of Germany into the Soviet Empire. In 1948, Stalin's plan was made clear when he established the Berlin Blockade, a barrier that prevented food and supplies from reaching West Berlin by road, rail, or canal. It was in protest against the newly introduced Deutschmark currency. Stalin didn't want Germany to have its own currency because that was another step towards independence. The Allies responded with the Berlin Airlift, a massive supply operation run by the US and Britain with help from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. In a year's time, they flew over 200 flights, that's over 500 flights a day, to keep the people of West Berlin supplied with necessities such as food, fuel, and medical supplies. But it was a challenging and dangerous operation, and a tough time for the German people. By May of 1949, Stalin realized that the blockade was pointless, and negotiations among the four occupying forces brought it to an end. As the years passed, the western occupied regions of Germany and its capital began to recover and grow. The standard of living was steadily improving along with it. With the open borders, citizens could move freely between the different regions, and people were headed for the west. As Stalin's behavior became more restrictive and more paranoid, a greater number of people wanted to leave the region he controlled. In 1950, 187,000 citizens moved to the west. In 1953, the number was 331,000. The people that were leaving were exactly the kind of people Stalin wanted to keep: doctors, lawyers, engineers, students, the young and well-educated. These are the people that help build nations, and they were leaving as quickly as they could. By 1955, Stalin had enough. He had created a defensible border around the Soviet-controlled area of Berlin, East Berlin. This initial border consisted of fences, trenches, and signs. There were gates through which citizens could move if they had proper credentials or difficult-to-obtain visitor pass. People could move through this area for medical reasons, business needs, or family visits. But still, people were going from East Berlin to West Berlin and not coming back. And this border was porous, easy to overcome. The flow of citizens out of East Germany was still happening. In August 1961, the Soviets had had enough. The border closed and the building of the wall began. West Berlin was now cut off from the rest of Germany.
Stalin called the wall an anti-fascist barrier, providing protection for his people against the evils of the capitalist West. The West called it the Wall of Shame and knew that it was created to keep the people of East Germany under Soviet control.
Families were divided, employees were cut off from their jobs, landowners were cut off from their property. West Berlin had become an island, an enclave, surrounded by Soviet-controlled territory. The wall itself ran almost 100 miles around the city. It was made of concrete and stood anywhere from 2 to nearly 4 meters tall.
It was bordered on the eastern side with anti-vehicle trenches, coils of barbed wire, spiked surfaces called figure beds, along with armed guards and dogs. The land was stripped of vegetation and lit with floodlights. It came to be known as the Death Strip. The wall had a total of 305 guard towers and 14 land-based border crossings.
From the Soviet point of view, the wall itself did its job. The flood of immigration slowed to a trickle. The economy began to grow. But the spirit of East German citizens and the opinions of most of the free world were not good. But now at this point in history, the U.S. was being led by the youngest president ever elected.
John F. Kennedy. Still recovering from the embarrassing Bay of Pigs failure in April 1961, Kennedy was in no mood to confront any more communists. His initial response was that the wall was much better than a war. Defending his stance just a month later in a speech to the United Nations, Kennedy said, "Mankind must put an end to war, or war will put an end to mankind." But by June of 1963, Kennedy was in West Berlin standing beside Mayor Willy Brandt, proclaiming to a crowd of 450,000 Berliners that he was one of them. Stating that free men everywhere were supporting West Germany, Kennedy said, "Freedom is indivisible."
Once the wall was built, the path to freedom became much more challenging for the people of East Berlin, but the desire was strong, and defectors began attempting to escape almost immediately.
In fact, the first documented defection was an East German border guard named Konrad Schumann. Just 3 days after the border closed, Schumann, reported for duty as usual, then casually turned around and leapt over the coils of barbed wire and sprinted to freedom in the West. Caught on camera by a West German journalist, the photo became one of the iconic images in the history of the Berlin Wall. Over the 28 years that the wall stood, there were at least 5,000 successful escapes. Many historians estimate the actual number was closer to 10,000, but since successful escapes were embarrassing to the East German authorities, they often went unreported.
There were some very creative escape methods too. One East German acrobat spotted an old power line that stretched over the wall and walked across the border on that. Another man took advantage of a similar circumstance, ziplined to freedom.
People used tunnels and hot air balloons to escape. One creative guy removed the windshield from his convertible so the entire vehicle was under 3 feet tall, tucked his mom in the trunk, and drove right under the barrier bar when the guard stepped in the booth to check his credentials.
All were seeking freedom. All were seeking a better life in the West. But despite the protest, despite the defections, despite the eyes of the world turned angrily against the Soviet Union, the Berlin Wall would stand for 28 years, almost as long as the Cold War itself.
Meanwhile, life went on. The years between 1961 and 1989 were turbulent and dynamic times all around the world. Civil rights, women's rights, the space race, and computer technology made huge advancements. But the people of the Soviet Union and its satellite states were largely outside of these advancements. They were behind the Iron Curtain.
But the citizens knew what was happening. News filtered in, and it made them restless. In March of 1985, the USSR got a new leader.
Mikhail Gorbachev. He had seen the power of the people during the Solidarity unionization movement in Poland in 1980, and it didn't frighten him, it motivated him. Gorbachev took over when the Russian economy was struggling. It desperately needed access to the technology that the rest of the world was using. He was not afraid to liberalize the Union. He quickly introduced the policies of glasnost and perestroika. Glasnost was a way of operating the Russian government with more openness and collaboration. Mikhail Gorbachev was looking for input from his citizens. He wanted them to openly discuss the good and the bad points of the Soviet government and work together to find solutions. The required changes led to perestroika, a restructuring of the Russian government and even society to a more open and collaborative model.
Gorbachev was looking to build relationships, and conveniently, US President Ronald Reagan was looking to build a legacy. If these two leaders could work together to end the Cold War and open the Eastern Bloc, it could be beneficial to both sides.
Reagan saw Gorbachev's glasnost as an opportunity, and he jumped on it. Gorbachev had offered to discuss nuclear disarmament with the United States. After some thought, the two countries arranged a meeting in Iceland to discuss the matter. It was largely successful, and the two men walked away from it with a solid working relationship.
Meanwhile, back in Berlin, the city was gearing up for the 750th anniversary celebration, and who should agree to attend but Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan?
It was time for another U.S. president to deliver a stirring speech to the German people. This time it was, to that point, the oldest man ever elected president, and as he stood before a crowd at the Brandenburg Gate, a mere 200 feet from the wall, and laid down the challenges before President Gorbachev, the amplifiers blasted the speech at such a volume it could clearly be heard on the East German side of the wall as well. It included this passage: General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
That was June of 1987. In August of 1989, the Soviet satellite of Hungary opened its borders to Austria.
When East Germans heard about it, 13,000 of them ran for freedom. In an attempt to stop the rush for the border, Hungary tried to close the border again, but angry and frightened citizens stormed the West German embassy and refused to leave. A movement began that was called the Peaceful Revolution. By November of '89, the new mayor of East Berlin, in an attempt to keep Germans in Germany, opened the gate to the western part of the city. But this gesture seemed to be too little, too late for the citizens. They wanted the wall down, and with hammers and chisels and their bare hands, they began to take it apart, piece by piece. The demolition party would continue for weeks.
The fall of the wall is considered the symbolic end of the Cold War. 2 years later, the Soviet Union dissolved. Berlin was once again a city united. All that remains of the wall today are the portions that were saved for historical landmarks, some checkpoints and guard towers, a museum to help us remember. We have to remember, there's always a wall being built somewhere. That was June of 1988. Free from Western competitions, and the opinions of most of the free world were not good.